In the 1950s, while American families hung stockings and sang carols, the Austrian government distributed leaflets with a warning printed in bold type. Krampus is an evil man. Psychologists warned parents. Police enforced curfews. Schools sent children home early on December 5th. An entire government apparatus fought to protect children from a folklore figure they believed could permanently damage young minds. The campaign failed completely. Today, Krampus walks American streets. Philadelphia, Portland, Los Angeles, New Orleans. Cities across the United States now host Krampusnacht celebrations, where horned figures chase crowds through downtown districts while families watch. What arrived as underground counterculture has become mainstream Christmas entertainment. Most people celebrating have no idea what they are invoking, or why it took 700 years of suppression to bring this demon across the Atlantic. This is the Pandoras Project. Tonight we unseal how a regional Alpine tradition survived centuries of bans, was weaponized by propagandists, and transformed into something American cities embrace every December. What most Americans know about Krampus comes from internet folklore and horror movies. The ancient pagan demon, the son of hell from Norse mythology, the Viking Christmas monster. Modern research reveals these supposedly ancient origins were invented by 20th century propagandists who rewrote folklore to serve political ideology. The real history is far stranger and far more disturbing. The name Krampus comes from the Old German word Krampen, meaning claw, referring to the grasping hands that would seize misbehaving children and drag them into mountain darkness. In isolated Alpine villages where winter meant death and survival required absolute obedience, the threat was not metaphor. It was a tool for survival that modern, comfortable American life struggles to comprehend. If you stayed to learn the real story beneath viral posts and holiday horror films, leave your mark below. Subscribe to walk further into these unsealed archives where internet myths meet documented historical truth. Share in the comments when you first heard about Krampus and whether December 5th meant something to fear or just another meme to scroll past. The archives reveal why every authority failed to destroy this tradition, and what they discovered in those mountain villages that terrified them more than any demon ever could. Part 1. The story as it is told. The legend most people know begins with an image. A creature that should not exist, walking through the December darkness with a sound like iron chains dragging across frozen cobblestones. Krampus stands over 2 meters tall when he straightens to his full height. His body is covered in dark, shaggy fur, matted and filthy, smelling of wet animal and something else underneath. Something that makes people step back even when they know the figure is only a man in a costume. The fur cannot completely hide what lies beneath. The suggestion of something wrong with the proportions. Limbs that bend at angles that human limbs should not bend. His horns curve upward from his skull, sometimes a single pair from a goat, sometimes multiple sets taken from different animals. Goat horns and sheep horns and the branching antlers of deer, all mounted together on a single head in a crown of bone that catches the firelight and throws jagged shadows across the walls of the houses he passes. His face is demonic. Eyes that glow with reflected light or painted to look like they glow. A gaping mouth full of sharp teeth carved from wood or cast from plaster. And the tongue. Always the tongue. Long and pointed and hanging from his mouth, painted red or black, moving as he moves, giving the mask a horrible suggestion of life. His hands are almost human, but the fingers are too long and they end in claws. The claws that gave him his name. Krampen, built for grasping. For holding on to something that struggles and wants desperately to escape. He wears chains. Heavy iron chains wrapped around his wrists and ankles and neck. The chains drag behind him when he walks. The sound arrives before he does. That metallic scraping rattle in the winter air. Parents hear it and pull their children closer. The chains are a symbol, though the children who hear them coming do not always understand the symbolism. They only know that something is approaching and the sound promises nothing good. In one clawed hand, Krampus carries a bundle of birch rods tied together with cord. These are called root in the traditional German. Thin, flexible branches perfect for striking flesh, hard enough to sting, but not hard enough to cause lasting damage. Usually, on his back, strapped with leather or rope, he carries a large wicker basket. Sometimes the basket is replaced with a burlap sack. The purpose is the same. It is large enough to fit a child inside, or several children, if they are packed tightly enough. The story says that Krampus does not walk alone. He walks with Saint Nicholas. Nicholas was a Christian bishop who lived in the 4th century in a city called Myra, located in what is now Turkey. He became famous after his death for his generosity toward the poor and especially toward children. The church canonized him, and his feast day on December 6th became a celebration dedicated to children across much of Europe. In the Alpine tradition that produced Krampus, Nicholas and the demon work as a team. They complement each other in a way that reveals something fundamental about how people in these mountain communities understood morality and consequence. Saint Nicholas embodies goodness, reward, and the joy of the Christmas season. He wears the traditional robes of a bishop with a golden staff and a long white beard. He carries a golden book in which all the good and bad deeds of every child from the past year are recorded. When he visits a house, he asks the children about their behavior. He has them recite prayers or poems to prove they have been paying attention to their religious education. For the children who have behaved well, who have obeyed their parents and said their prayers and done their chores without complaint, Nicholas has gifts: sweet apples and nuts and gingerbread and small wooden toys. He places these into the boots or shoes the children have left outside their door. The good children also receive a golden branch as a symbol of their exemplary behavior. But for the naughty children, Krampus waits. On the night of December 5th, known as Krampusnacht or Krampus night, the ritual begins. While Nicholas is busy inside the house with the good children, Krampus lurks just outside the door. The children can hear him. The stomping of his hooves on the frozen ground. The rattling of his chains. Sometimes, a low growling sound that might be coming from the mask, or might be coming from the man wearing the mask who has perhaps had too much to drink and is enjoying his role a little too much. The children who have behaved badly during the year must face Krampus. Children who lied to their parents. Children who stole. Children who refused to do their chores or were cruel to their younger siblings or showed disrespect to their elders. These children receive the mildest form of Krampus punishment, which is a thrashing with the birch rods. He beats them until they cry and promise to improve their behavior. Instead of gifts, they receive only lumps of coal, or in some versions, a silver branch to mark their misdeeds. But for the truly evil children, the ones who show no remorse or who have been terrible all year long, Krampus has a much worse punishment waiting. These children he stuffs into his basket or sack. He carries them away from their homes and into the darkness. Where he takes them depends on which version of the story you hear. Some say he drags them to his cave in the mountains where he keeps them as slaves for an entire year, forcing them to work in darkness and cold until the next December 5th comes and he releases them, if they have learned their lesson. Other versions claim he takes them to the underworld, to the realm of the dead and demons, where they must atone for their sins in ways the stories do not specify, but which children are encouraged to imagine. The darkest versions, the ones whispered in remote mountain villages where winters were long and brutal and parents needed every tool available to keep their children obedient and alive, say that Krampus eats the children. In these tales, he is a true demon who feeds on fear and flesh. He takes the children to his cave and devours them while they scream. On the morning of December 6th, Nicholas Day, families discover what the night has brought. The well-behaved children find their gifts and celebrate. The naughty children nurse their welts from the birch rods and promise silently to do better. And in rare cases, a child has disappeared. When this happens, the villagers whisper that Krampus took it. They do not search. There is nothing to find. Today, especially in Austria and the southern German region of Bavaria, the Krampus tradition lives on in a different form called Krampuslauf, which means Krampus Run. These are parades where young men dress as various versions of Krampus and march through the streets. They wear elaborately carved wooden masks that are works of art in themselves, heavy fur costumes made from real animal pelts, chains that weigh 20 kilograms or more. These runs are often fueled by alcohol and can become very wild. The costumed figures chase spectators, shake their chains at children, and sometimes strike people with their rods, though usually lightly. The masks are often passed down through families across generations. Each region has its own style and traditions. Some Krampus figures have multiple sets of horns. Others have particularly long tongues or eyes that seem to glow in the darkness. The costumes represent hundreds of hours of work by master woodcarvers who consider this a serious craft with centuries of tradition behind it. For many people, Krampus has become a symbol of the wild, untamed side of Christmas, a counterpoint to the commercialized, sanitized version of the holiday that dominates in many other countries. He represents something that refuses to be gentle or safe or appropriate for all ages. This is the story as it is told, but it is not the story as it happened. Part 2. The Debunking and Real History. While these stories are fascinating and contain their own kind of truth, what most people think they know about where Krampus came from is largely wrong. The truth behind this figure has been distorted over centuries by various political and religious forces, each with their own reasons for rewriting the past. Here begins the real story. A story of lies and propaganda, and the systematic falsification of folklore for ideological purposes. The most popular claim circulating today, especially on the internet, is that Krampus is the son of Hel, the Norse goddess who rules over the underworld in Scandinavian mythology. According to this version, Krampus is an ancient pagan deity who predates Christianity by thousands of years. A demon from the Viking Age who wandered through Scandinavian forests, terrifying children long before the birth of Christ. This story sounds romantic and mysterious, and connects Krampus to the broader world of Norse mythology that has become very popular in modern culture. It is also completely invented. There is no mention of Krampus anywhere in the Poetic Edda, the collection of Old Norse poems that forms the primary source for Norse mythology. There is no mention in the Prose Edda, the 13th century work by Snorri Sturluson that systematized Norse myths into a coherent narrative. There is no mention in any saga or skaldic poem or runic inscription or any other primary source from Scandinavian culture. The name Krampus does not appear in Old Norse. The concept does not appear. The son of Hel story has no basis in actual Norse mythology whatsoever. So where did it come from? The false pagan origin story for Krampus was invented in the early 20th century by National Socialist-aligned ethnologists and proto-fascist folklorists, particularly Victor von Geramve and Richard Wolfram. These scholars wanted to portray Christianity as a corrupting foreign force that had destroyed authentic Germanic customs. They created a narrative in which Krampus and similar figures were remnants of pre-Christian European paganism that the Church had tried to suppress, but which survived in folk memory. This fit their larger political project of promoting Germanic racial superiority and discrediting Christian religious authority as a non-Germanic influence. This fabricated pagan narrative was then fully weaponized by the National Socialist Party in Germany during the 1930s. The Nazis published photo essays and propaganda materials portraying Krampus as an ancient custom that had been banned by Christians because of its pagan roots. They presented this as evidence of the Church's war against authentic Germanic culture. This was pure propaganda designed to serve their ideology of Germanic racial superiority and their need to construct a mythical past that justified their political program. None of it was based on historical evidence. After World War II, the Nazi associations with this false narrative were conveniently forgotten, but the claims themselves persisted. The story of Krampus as an ancient pagan figure banned by the Church had taken on a life of its own. It sounded plausible enough that people repeated it without checking the actual historical record. And in the age of the internet, the story mutated further. The claim that Krampus was the son of hell specifically seems to have emerged from modern websites and social media posts, probably sometime in the early 2000s. It spread virally because it connected Krampus to the popular mythology of Vikings and made the figure seem more ancient and mysterious than the truth allowed. The truth is less epic, but more interesting. The actual documented history of Krampus begins much later and in a different place. The first recorded mention of Krampusnacht traditions dates to 1582 in the Bavarian town of Dießen, located about 80 kilometers southwest of Munich in what is now southern Germany. The document is a casual reference that uses the name Perchten, not Krampus. But this is clearly referring to the same tradition. A winter figure associated with December who appears in demonic form to frighten and punish. The Perchten are the key to understanding where Krampus actually came from. These are mischievous and sometimes malevolent Alpine spirits that appear in the folklore of the mountain regions spanning Austria and southern Germany. Documents from the 17th and 18th centuries show that church authorities, particularly the archbishops of Salzburg, repeatedly tried to ban Perchten traditions. Salzburg, a city in Austria about 150 kilometers southeast of Munich, was then an independent archbishopric where the archbishop held both religious and political power. These bans were not primarily aimed at the folkloric figures themselves. They were aimed at controlling the wild celebrations that accompanied the Perchten runs. Young men would dress in demonic costumes and parade through the streets in celebrations that often involved heavy drinking, property damage, and violence. The church wanted order, not the elimination of folk customs per se. But the bans were largely ineffective. The Alpine regions were remote and sparsely populated. Communication was difficult. Enforcement was nearly impossible. The traditions survived in the mountain villages where they had always lived. In the late 19th century, something changed. The tradition that had been fading began to revive, and it did so in a very modern way. In 1869, the Austro-Hungarian Empire created the first postal postcard system in the world. By the late 1880s and into the early 1900s, nearly 2 decades after postcards were first introduced, a phenomenon exploded across the empire. Krampuskarten. Krampus cards. Postcards featuring illustrations of the demon. Millions of these cards were printed and sent. They were not niche or obscure. They were mainstream popular culture. The cards fell into 3 main categories, and examining them reveals something important about how people at the time understood Krampus. The first category showed Krampus in his terrifying role. These cards depicted him thrashing children with birch rods, stuffing them into his basket, dragging them away with chains. These were sent from parents to children as genuine behavioral warnings, a reminder that December 5th was coming and certain types of behavior would have consequences. The second category was stranger. These cards showed Krampus with fashionable women in romantic or suggestive poses. Sometimes the women were fleeing from him. Sometimes they were capturing him. These cards satirized courtship anxieties and gender dynamics. They turned the demon into a symbol of male aggression and female power or vulnerability depending on the specific image. The third category presented Krampus and St. Nicholas as work colleagues. They traveled together in sleighs. They prepared for their annual rounds like civil servants organizing a bureaucratic task. The partnership was portrayed as a seasonal job. This domesticated the demon, made him part of the social machinery rather than a genuine supernatural threat. The significance of the Krampuskarten cannot be overstated. They prove that the commercialization and mass media spread of Krampus happened 140 years ago, not in the internet age. The transformation of Krampus from a village folk tradition into a reproducible commodity that could be bought and sold and sent through the mail occurred in the late 19th century. Anyone claiming that Krampus was somehow pure or more authentic before the internet got hold of him is ignoring the fact that he was already a commercial product before World War I. Around the same time, The name Krampus itself became standardized. In 1862, a newspaper was published in Budapest under the name Krampus. In 1865, it published a picture of Santa Claus with a demonic figure lurking behind him, solidifying the creature's appearance and explicitly connecting him to Christmas rather than just to St. Nicholas' feast day. This marked another shift. Krampus was being absorbed into the broader commercial celebration of Christmas, moving beyond his original religious context. The modern figure we recognize as Krampus, with his specific appearance and his specific role, emerged during the 19th century, not in the distant pagan past, not thousands of years ago in Viking longhouses. In the 1800s, as folklorists began documenting rural traditions and as commercial interests began packaging those traditions for urban consumption, the archives reveal a pattern. Krampus is not ancient in the way that people want him to be ancient. He is a product of relatively recent history, shaped by the same forces of modernity and commercialization that shaped everything else in the 19th and 20th centuries. The Viking story is a lie, but the truth is no less dark. Part 3. Alpine Origins and Regional Spread. The real origins of Krampus lie in an older Alpine tradition called the Perchten. To understand Krampus, we have to understand the Perchten first. These are wild demonic figures from Alpine folklore, named after a figure called Percht or Berchte. In the traditional stories, Perchten are described as bipedal creatures resembling goats, but with elongated necks and disturbing human characteristics. People dressed in costumes representing these figures and marched in processions known as Perchten runs. The Catholic Church viewed these processions with deep suspicion. Church documents from the 17th and 18th centuries make it clear that authorities considered the Perchten runs to be pagan holdovers that had no place in a Christian society. Various civil authorities banned them outright. But enforcement was difficult to impossible. The Alpine regions were harsh environments with sparse populations spread across difficult terrain. Communication between isolated villages and the centers of religious or political power could take days or weeks. Local communities continued their traditions in defiance of distant authorities who had no practical way to stop them. Based on regional documentation and the persistence of these traditions in Western Austria, folklorists estimate that variations of the Perchten custom go back approximately 1,500 years. This makes them genuinely old, though not as old as the false Nazi and socialist propaganda claimed. The Perchten are not Norse. They are not Viking. They are specifically Alpine, emerging from the unique cultural and environmental conditions of communities living in the mountains between what is now Germany and Austria. Within the broader category of Perchten, different figures serve different functions. This is where Frau Perchte enters the story, and she is important because she shows that Krampus was not the only terrifying figure walking through December darkness. Frau Perchte is a female entity with a dual nature. In some stories, she appears as a beautiful woman dressed in white, radiant and goddess-like. In other stories, she appears as a haggard crone with matted hair and a hunched back. Her role is to enforce household duties, particularly among women and girls. She checks whether they have finished their spinning, whether they have kept the house clean, whether they have performed the domestic labor expected of them. The punishment for negligence is specific and horrible. Frau Perchte carries a hidden knife. If she finds that a woman or girl has shirked her duties, she slits open their belly while they sleep. She removes the entrails. She stuffs the abdominal cavity with straw and rocks. Then she sews the victim back up. In the morning, they are found stitched and dead. This is not a figure designed for moral instruction of children. This is a figure designed to enforce patriarchal control of women's labor through the threat of mutilation and death. Frau Perchte appears during the same season as Krampus, during the 12 nights known as Rauhnächte, when the boundary between the physical world and the spirit world is believed to thin. In modern Krampuslauf parades, Perchte masks often appear alongside Krampus masks, representing the diversity of figures within the Perchten tradition. The fact that Perchten is a category containing multiple figures tells us something important. Krampus was not a single, isolated demon. He was one manifestation among many of a broader Alpine tradition of winter spirits who enforced social norms through fear. The specific name, Krampus, derived from Krampen meaning claw, appears to have become standardized relatively late to distinguish this particular child-punishing, chain-dragging variant from other Perchten figures. The regional variations in naming prove how widespread these traditions were across Germanic Europe. In Bavaria, which is part of modern Germany, the figure is called Klaubauf. In various parts of Austria and Bavaria, he is known as Strohbart. In the southern regions of Austria, the names include Bartel, Niglo Bartel, Wu Bartel, Barl, and Bartholomeus. In German-speaking Switzerland, which lies south of Germany, the equivalent figure is called Schmutzli, meaning little dirty one. In the Würzburg region of Bavaria, the name is Popel or Hula Popel. Near the German border in what is now Czechia, he is called Zember. The tradition spread beyond Germanic-speaking regions as well. In Slovenia, which was strongly influenced by Austrian culture for centuries, the figure is called Parkelji and serves as companion to Miklaj, the Slovenian form of Saint Nicholas. In Bosnia and Herzegovina and Croatia, the figure is described as a devil carrying a cloth sack over his shoulder with chains around his neck, ankles, and wrists. Children who behave well receive a golden branch symbolizing their good deeds. Children who behave badly receive a silver branch and no gifts, because Krampus takes the gifts for himself. These regional variations did not arise by chance. They reflect the complex history of the Alpine regions, where different peoples and cultures lived together and influenced each other over centuries. The Holy Roman Empire, which included large parts of present-day Germany and Austria, was a patchwork of duchies, counties, and principalities, each with its own local traditions. Folklore spread across these regions and adapted to local conditions, developing distinct names and characteristics while retaining the same basic archetype. A horned demonic figure associated with winter and punishment, walking in partnership or in parallel with the gift-giving saint. What this tells us is that the need for this type of figure was widespread throughout Germanic culture. It was not imposed from outside. It was not borrowed from Vikings. It emerged organically from communities that shared certain cultural assumptions about morality, childhood, obedience, and the dangers of winter darkness. Part 4. Church Resistance and Suppressions. The history of resistance against Krampus is a chronicle of failure. Over the centuries, various authorities tried to suppress or eliminate this tradition. Every attempt not only failed but seemed to make Krampus more powerful and more symbolically important to the communities that refused to let him die. The first documented attempts to ban Krampus celebrations date to the 12th century. The Catholic Church saw the demonic appearance of the figure as a theological problem. Krampus looked too much like Satan. The horns, the cloven hooves, the dark fur, the generally diabolic appearance made him a problematic figure for a religion where the battle between good and evil was a central narrative. How could the Church allow people to celebrate a figure that so clearly resembled the enemy of all souls? But these early bans were largely unsuccessful. Alpine communities lay far from the large church centers. Communication over the mountainous terrain was difficult and time-consuming. Local priests in remote villages often had more pressing concerns than enforcing bans against folk celebrations, especially when those celebrations were deeply embedded in local culture and when enforcing the bans would create resentment and conflict with their congregations. The conflict escalated in the 17th and 18th centuries. The archbishops of Salzburg made repeated documented efforts to end the Krampus and Perchten traditions. Salzburg was not just a religious center. As an archbishopric, it was also a political entity where the archbishop wielded both spiritual and secular authority over a large territory. Church archives contain multiple edicts attempting to ban the demonic processions. But the motivation was not purely religious. Krampuslauf celebrations were often wild, alcohol-fueled events that could and did lead to serious problems. There are historical reports of injuries, property damage, and sexual assaults during these celebrations. Young men in demonic costumes, their identities hidden behind masks, emboldened by alcohol and the anonymity and the collective energy of the crowd, could become genuinely dangerous. The church wanted to maintain order as much as it wanted to eliminate pagan elements. Faced with the impossibility of eliminating the tradition entirely, the church attempted a different strategy. Instead of banning Krampus, they would Christianize him. This strategy is called enculturation, the process by which the church absorbs and transforms local customs rather than destroying them outright. Saint Nicholas was elevated to the starring role. The kind, generous bishop who loved children became the main character of the tradition. Krampus was demoted to his servant. This was a significant transformation. Krampus was no longer an independent demonic force acting according to his own nature. He was a tool wielded by a Christian saint to execute divine justice. The wild mountain spirit became the subordinate of the church's representative. The iron chains that Krampus wore became a symbol of his subjugation. He was a demon bound in service to the holy. This compromise allowed the tradition to survive while supposedly bringing it under Christian control. But the compromise was always unstable. Krampus remained too popular, too visually striking, and too symbolically powerful to stay in his subordinate role. In practice, especially in the wild energy of Krampuslauf celebrations, he often overshadowed Nicholas entirely. The 18th century brought a new challenge from an unexpected direction. The Age of Enlightenment emphasized reason, science, and progress. Enlightenment philosophers and reformers viewed folk customs like Krampus as superstitions that modern, rational people should outgrow. They argued that belief in demonic figures, even theatrical demonic figures, represented backward thinking that had no place in an advanced civilization. But Enlightenment rationalism had no more success at eliminating Krampus than church authority had. The 20th century brought three major waves of suppression, each revealing something different about why Krampus proved impossible to kill. In 1934, the Austrian government under Engelbert Dollfuss banned Krampuslauf celebrations. The Dollfuss regime, known as Austrofascism, promoted a campaign called My Austria that aimed to create a unified Catholic nationalist identity. Krampus represented everything this campaign opposed. He was regional rather than national. He was a pagan embarrassment. He was associated with social chaos and disorder. The official prohibition was enforced by police, but banning Krampus transformed him into a symbol of resistance. To wear the Krampus mask became an act of political rebellion. To celebrate Krampusnacht became a way of defying state authority. The persecution gave Krampus a new kind of power. He was no longer just a folk tradition. He was a statement about local identity and the right of communities to maintain their customs against centralized power. Then came the Nazi period, and the story became more complicated. The National Socialists both banned Krampus celebrations and co-opted his imagery for propaganda purposes. They published photo essays portraying Krampus as an ancient Germanic custom that had been suppressed by foreign Christian influences. This fit their larger narrative about the need to reclaim authentic German culture from corrupting outside forces. They invented a past for Krampus that served their racial ideology, regardless of what the historical evidence actually showed. This Nazi propaganda is the direct origin of many of the false stories about Krampus' ancient pagan roots that still circulate today. The lies were designed to serve a genocidal political movement. After World War II, the Nazi associations were conveniently forgotten, but their fabricated history remained embedded in popular understanding. The third wave came in the 1950s and 1960s. This time the threat came from psychology and modern ideas about childhood development. The Austrian government distributed leaflets with the title Krampus ist ein böser Mann, meaning Krampus is an evil man. The campaign warned that encounters with such a terrifying figure could cause lasting psychological damage to children. This concern was not entirely irrational. Psychologists and pediatricians were beginning to research how fear affects child development. The post-war period was a time of attempting to build a better, more modern society free from the traumas of the past. Expert opinion and scientific analysis were replacing traditional wisdom in many areas of life. The government believed it was protecting children, but this modern, scientifically justified ban had only limited success. It worked in cities where educated middle-class families were receptive to expert advice. It failed in rural areas where the tradition was most deeply rooted. Many families secretly continued to pass the tradition from grandparents to grandchildren. Krampus became part of cultural identity, something that defined the community against outside pressure to modernize and conform. The pattern is clear. Every suppression wave, regardless of whether it came from religious authority, political ideology, or scientific expertise, strengthened rather than weakened the tradition. Each attempt to eliminate Krampus made him more symbolically important. The bans proved that he represented something that could not be eradicated by decree, something that communities needed or wanted badly enough to preserve in defiance of powerful institutions. Part 5. Modern Krampuslauf culture. Beginning in the 1950s and 1960s, despite the government psychology campaign warning parents to protect their children from traumatic encounters with demons, the Krampus tradition experienced a remarkable revival. This was part of a larger cultural movement across Europe to preserve folk traditions in a rapidly modernizing world. People began to recognize that their old customs were not necessarily obstacles to progress, but parts of their identity worth protecting. The Krampus runs that had once been limited to remote mountain villages became large-scale organized events. Today, these modern festivals attract thousands of visitors. They have developed significantly from their historical predecessors while retaining many traditional elements. Modern Krampuslauf events are carefully organized with safety measures, barriers for crowd control, professional lighting, and sound equipment. What was once spontaneous and chaotic has become choreographed and managed, though it still retains an edge of genuine danger and wildness. At the heart of the modern tradition is the craft of mask making. Today, in Austria and Germany, there is a thriving community of woodcarvers and artisans dedicated to creating traditional Krampus masks. These masks, traditionally called larven from the Latin word larva meaning both mask and ghost, are often genuine works of art. A single mask can require hundreds of hours of skilled labor and cost thousands of euros. The woodcarving techniques follow centuries-old patterns passed down through generations of craftsmen. Different regions maintain distinct stylistic traditions. Bavarian masks tend to be more robust and less ornate, emphasizing raw, threatening power. Austrian masks often feature finer carving work and more complex details, with elaborate texturing and intricate patterns carved into the surface. These regional differences reflect the separate craft traditions and aesthetic preferences that developed in areas that, despite their proximity and cultural similarities, maintain distinct local identities. Modern Krampus enthusiasts organize into groups called Passen. These are formal clubs that work together throughout the year, not just in December. Membership in a pass often requires meeting strict criteria. Members must demonstrate commitment to understanding the tradition, willingness to invest significant time and money into their costumes, and physical ability to wear and perform in gear that can weigh more than 20 kilograms. A complete Krampus costume is an impressive assemblage. It includes an elaborately carved wooden mask, a heavy coat made from real animal fur, hand-forged iron chains, artistically designed horns taken from various animals and mounted together, and specially constructed boots or hoof covers. The combined weight of a full costume often exceeds 20 kilograms. Performing in such a costume for hours during a Krampuslauf requires considerable physical endurance. Participants train for this. The performances themselves have evolved. Traditional Krampus runs were unpredictable and often genuinely frightening. Costumed figures would chase people randomly, strike them with birch rods with real force, and sometimes cause injuries. Modern performances are more controlled. Many pass and choreograph specific routines. These can include synchronized dances, acrobatic movements, and dramatic scenes depicting the interaction between St. Nicholas and Krampus. The goal is to balance authenticity and cultural preservation with entertainment value and safety. But incidents still occur. The alcohol-fueled chaos has not been entirely eliminated. There are documented cases of serious injuries during modern Krampuslauf events. Participants sometimes break bones. Spectators sometimes get hurt when a costumed Krampus becomes too enthusiastic with his birch rod, or when crowd control fails and people are trampled. The danger is part of the appeal for some participants and spectators. Krampus is supposed to be frightening. Making him completely safe would, in some sense, destroy what he represents. Many modern Krampus groups emphasize their role as cultural preservationists. They see themselves as maintaining an important tradition against the forces of globalization and cultural homogenization. Members often invest significant time researching the history of their local Krampus traditions, working with historians and folklorists to ensure their performances are as historically accurate as possible. This emphasis on authenticity is partly a reaction to decades of false claims about Krampus origins. Modern practitioners are often very well informed about the actual history and very committed to correcting myths and misinformation. They know that Krampus is not the son of hell. They know the Nazi propaganda was lies. They want people to understand the real Alpine origins and the real cultural significance. In 2014, UNESCO recognized the Austrian Krampus tradition as part of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity. This was official international validation after centuries of persecution. The same tradition that church authorities tried to ban in the 17th century, that the Dollfuss regime prohibited in the 1930s, that the Austrian government warned against in the 1950s, was now formally recognized as culturally valuable and worth preserving for future generations. The UNESCO recognition marked a turning point. It legitimized Krampus in a way that popular enthusiasm alone could not. It placed the tradition alongside other recognized folk customs as part of human cultural diversity worthy of respect and protection. Part 6. International relatives. Krampus is not unique. Across areas that experience Germanic cultural influence, we find similar figures playing similar roles. These international relatives reveal that the archetype of the winter punishment figure spread far beyond the Alps and adapted to different environments while retaining its core function. The most relevant of these relatives for an American audience is Belsnickel, a figure brought to the United States by German immigrants during the 18th and 19th centuries. Belsnickel is particularly associated with Pennsylvania, which was a major destination for German immigration during this period. The communities now known as Pennsylvania Dutch, though Dutch is actually a corruption of Deutsch, meaning German, were primarily descended from immigrants from the Palatinate region of Germany. The name Belsnickel is a distortion of Pels Nickel, meaning furry Nicholas. This figure combines both the friendly and the frightening aspects of St. Nicholas and Krampus into a single entity. Belsnickel is less overtly demonic than the traditional Alpine Krampus, but he retains the punishment element. He wears ragged furs, has a dirty or soot-covered face, and carries a rod or switch with which he threatens or strikes naughty children. He asks children if they have been good, and if they lie, or if he determines they have not behaved, he beats them. What makes Belsnickel particularly interesting is how the Germanic tradition adapted to American conditions. The Pennsylvania Dutch communities maintained many of their old customs, but those customs evolved in the New World. America had its own dangers. The frontier was threatening enough without adding mythological terrors. Belsnickel became somewhat less wild and more domesticated than his Alpine cousins, but he never became completely safe or comfortable. The existence of Belsnickel means that Germanic winter punishment figures existed in America for more than 200 years before Krampus specifically arrived in the early 2000s. When Krampus appeared in American cities in 2004 and 2005, he was not introducing a completely foreign concept. He was reintroducing a tradition that German immigrants had already brought centuries earlier. Belsnickel had faded from popular awareness outside Pennsylvania Dutch communities. Krampus, more visually dramatic and better suited to modern horror aesthetics, displaced his older American cousin. In Switzerland, the equivalent figure is called Schmutzli, literally meaning little dirty one. The name refers to his appearance with a soot-blackened face. Schmutzli accompanies Samichlaus, the Swiss version of St. Nicholas. He carries a large sack that contains both treats for good children and rods for punishment. Switzerland's complex cultural landscape, where German, French, and Italian influences meet, produced regional variations. In some Swiss cantons, Schmutzli is a relatively friendly figure. In others, he retains more of the threatening nature associated with Krampus. These variations reflect the decentralized nature of Swiss culture and politics. In France, particularly in eastern regions like Lorraine and Alsace that have historical connections to Germany, there exists Père Fouettard. The name translates as Father Whipper, describing his primary function clearly. Père Fouettard is the dark companion of Saint Nicholas in French tradition. He accompanies the saint and handles the punishment of naughty children while Nicholas handles the rewards. The existence of this figure in France demonstrates how cultural boundaries are permeable. Alsace and Lorraine changed hands between French and German rule multiple times throughout history, and these political shifts were reflected in local folklore, which absorbed influences from both cultures. The Netherlands has Zwarte Piet, meaning Black Peter, who serves as helper to Sinterklaas, the Dutch Saint Nicholas. This figure has become extremely controversial in recent years because the traditional portrayal involves white people painting their faces black, which many now consider racist. Setting aside modern controversies, Zwarte Piet historically played a similar role to Krampus. He was responsible for the punishment side of the moral equation, while Sinterklaas handled rewards. His methods were less extreme than Krampus dragging children to the underworld, but the basic dynamic of good cop, bad cop, saint and shadow, remained the same. Iceland offers one of the most interesting relatives in the figure of Grýla. This is a giantess from Icelandic folklore who lives in the mountains and comes to towns and villages at Christmas time specifically to find and eat naughty children. She is the mother of the Yule lads, 13 troll brothers who each have specific tricks they play and specific types of misbehavior they punish. The Icelandic tradition is fascinating because it shows how Germanic folklore developed in isolation. Iceland was settled primarily by Norwegian colonists in the 9th and 10th centuries who brought their mythological traditions with them. Over the following centuries, separated from the European mainland, these traditions evolved into something distinctively Icelandic while retaining recognizably Germanic elements. What all these figures share is a common pattern: a dark figure associated with winter, partnership with or parallel to a gift-giving saint, responsibility for punishment and enforcement of moral standards. Focus on children as the primary audience and target. These similarities suggest that the need for such figures was widespread across Northern European cultures. The long, dark winters, the isolation, the dangers of cold and hunger, all created conditions where communities used fear as a tool to enforce the behavior necessary for survival. Part 7. The American Arrival and Transformation. Krampus arrived in America, specifically, in 2004 and 2005. The exact origin is debated. Some sources credit Philadelphia, others Portland. What is clear is that the first specifically Krampus-themed Krampuslauf celebrations in the United States happened during this period, organized by people with Austrian or German heritage connections and by folklore enthusiasts who wanted to bring the tradition to American soil. The timing is significant. Post 9/11, America was in a cultural moment of interest in darker aesthetics. The optimism of the 1990s had curdled into something more anxious and uncertain. At the same time, there was growing cultural exhaustion with the hyper-commercialized version of Christmas that dominated American culture. Every year, the commercial pressure started earlier. Every year, the mandatory cheer felt more forced. Every year, people spent more money and felt less satisfied. Krampus offered an alternative. He was a rebellion against the sanitized Christmas, against the relentless positivity, against the commercial machinery that had turned a religious holiday into a consumption festival. Krampus represented permission to acknowledge that the holiday season is also stressful, that families are also dysfunctional, that not everyone feels joy during December, and that pretending otherwise is exhausting. The 2010 explosion happened rapidly. In 2015, director Michael Dougherty released a horror film simply titled Krampus. The film brought the figure into mainstream American awareness. It was not a great film by critical standards, but it was successful enough to demonstrate market demand. A boom of Krampus-themed horror movies followed between 2010 and 2020. Most were low-budget and forgettable, but they kept Krampus visible in American popular culture. Krampuslauf events proliferated. Philadelphia, Los Angeles, New Orleans, Portland, Austin, and dozens of other American cities launched annual Krampus celebrations. These events were usually organized by local cultural organizations, often with ties to German or Austrian immigrant communities, sometimes by horror fans and Halloween enthusiasts who saw Krampus as an extension of October aesthetics into December. Breweries hosted Krampus nights. Artists offered mask carving workshops. The parades grew from small gatherings into events attracting thousands of participants and spectators. But the American version of Krampus differed from the Alpine original in significant ways. In Austria and Germany, Krampus remains tied, at least nominally, to St. Nicholas. The traditional date of December 5th and 6th is generally observed. The religious and folkloric context is understood even by people who no longer take it seriously. In America, Krampus became decoupled from Nicholas. He became a standalone figure, an anti-Santa rather than Santa's dark companion. American Krampus events happen throughout November and December, not tied to specific dates. The religious context faded, replaced by a more generalized horror aesthetic, influenced by movies and Halloween culture. This American transformation bothered some traditionalists who felt that removing Krampus from his original context and partnership with St. Nicholas destroyed his meaning. The complaint was that Americans had turned a genuine folk tradition into a holiday-themed mascot, another commercialized icon to be exploited and forgotten. But defenders of the American adaptation pointed out that folklore has always evolved. The 1930s postcards already commercialized Krampus. The Nazi propaganda already distorted him. The church already tried to subordinate him. Every era transforms inherited traditions. The American version was simply the latest chapter in a long history of adaptation. The psychological function Krampus serves in modern America is worth examining. American Christmas culture is characterized by an almost aggressive insistence on happiness. Homes must be perfectly decorated. Families must be harmonious. Everyone must be grateful and joyful. The cultural pressure to perform perfect contentment during the holidays is intense. But reality does not cooperate. Families fight. Loneliness intensifies. Financial stress worsens. The gap between the idealized Christmas and the lived experience creates a kind of psychological pressure with no acceptable release valve. Krampus provides that release. He has permission to acknowledge the darkness, permission to admit that Christmas is hard, permission to feel anger or fear or sadness instead of forced cheer. The figure channels something that American culture otherwise suppresses. This is not nostalgia for authentic European folklore. This is Americans discovering that they need the same psychological tools that Alpine communities needed. The tool for acknowledging that light without shadow is not balance, but delusion. Social media accelerated Krampus spread dramatically. Instagram and YouTube made it possible for images and videos of Krampus runs to reach global audiences instantly. This digital dissemination had contradictory effects. It raised awareness and attracted new enthusiasts. But it also contributed to the spread of misinformation, particularly the viral false claim about Krampus being the son of hell. Social media rewards simple, shareable narratives over complex historical truth. The Viking story was more shareable than the actual story of Alpine villages and church politics. As of 2025, Krampus events happen in hundreds of American cities. The tradition continues to grow. Arguments continue about authenticity versus evolution, about cultural appropriation versus cultural exchange, about whether American Krampus celebrations honor or exploit the Alpine tradition. But the fact remains that Krampus has taken root in American soil. He walks through streets in Los Angeles and Philadelphia and New Orleans exactly as he walks through streets in Salzburg and Munich and Berchtesgaden. Different countries, different languages, different contexts, same horns, same chains, same function. Final part. The truth is darker than the lie. The archive closes, but the chains keep dragging. Through American streets now, just as they dragged through Bavarian villages 4 centuries ago. Different streets, same function. The details change. Postcards become memes. Birch switches become merchandise. Parish bands become parental complaints. Government leaflets warning about psychological damage become think pieces about cultural appropriation. But the horned figure endures because the need for him endures. The Viking story gave us something we wanted. Ancient gods and cosmic battles. A demon emerging from the mists of time, older than Christianity, older than civilization itself. Something epic and mysterious that we could share online with a satisfying sense of ancient wisdom. The Norse connection made Krampus part of a larger mythology that modern culture has romanticized and commodified. It made him cool. The real story gives us something much less comfortable. It gives us starving Alpine communities during years when the rain would not stop and the crops would not grow, calculating what they would have to do to survive the winter. It gives us church authorities who could not eliminate a folk tradition, so they enslaved it instead, literally chaining the demon and forcing him to serve Christian purposes. It gives us fascist governments banning celebrations while simultaneously co-opting the imagery for propaganda photographs. It gives us National Socialists inventing a false past to justify genocide. It gives us commercial postcards from the 1890s showing a demon stuffing screaming children into wicker baskets, sent through the mail as Christmas greetings between respectable families who thought this was charming. We bought the Norse lie because the Alpine truth is too uncomfortable. It forces us to confront things about European history and about human nature that the Viking story allows us to avoid. Krampus exists because communities needed consequences. They needed fear. They needed a tool to enforce the behavior necessary for survival when winter could kill, and when there was no margin for error. Every generation tries to build a version of Christmas made only of light, pure gift-giving, universal kindness, unconditional love, consequence-free joy. And every generation discovers that a morality system with only rewards and no punishments collapses. That light without shadow does not create balance, but creates a different kind of darkness. The sanitized holiday becomes an oppressive performance of mandatory happiness that denies the reality of human experience. The pressure to be grateful and joyful and perfect becomes its own form of cruelty. And in that collapse, in that moment when the performance becomes unbearable, hoofprints appear in fresh snow. The chains rattle in the distance. December 5th approaches whether we are ready or not. Krampus is not the son of hell escaping from Norse mythology. He is something both less and more than that. He is the shadow that every culture that celebrates midwinter light must eventually acknowledge. The recognition that survival required more than kindness, that raising children required more than love, that community required enforcement, that winter was genuinely dangerous, and the monsters in the stories were teaching tools for keeping people alive. The iron chains were never about binding a demon. They were about binding us to the acknowledgement that we are not and have never been purely good, that our holidays emerged from times of genuine darkness and genuine fear. that the commercialized Christmas we inherited is built on foundations of hunger and cold and the very real possibility of death. Modern America discovered it needed Krampus for the same reasons that 16th century Bavaria needed him. Not because of some unbroken tradition or authentic cultural continuity. Because the same human needs emerge in different times and places when the conditions are similar enough. The exhaustion with forced cheer. The pressure to perform perfect family harmony. The financial stress of consumption expectations. The loneliness that intensifies during a season dedicated to togetherness. All of this creates the same psychological conditions that Alpine villages experienced, just in different form. Krampus gives permission. Permission to acknowledge that Christmas is difficult. Permission to admit that we are not always joyful. Permission to recognize that morality requires both reward and consequence, both light and shadow, both the saint and the demon walking together through December darkness. The tradition will continue to evolve. American Krampus will drift further from Alpine Krampus. New false origin stories will emerge and spread. Commercial interests will find new ways to package and sell the image. Purists will complain about authenticity while participating in a tradition that has been changing and adapting for 400 documented years and probably much longer. Arguments about cultural appropriation and proper representation will continue. None of this will stop the chains from rattling. Because Krampus, whatever else he is, has proven over centuries that he cannot be suppressed by authority, cannot be eliminated by modernity, cannot be sanitized into harmlessness, and cannot be reduced to a commercial mascot no matter how many cheap plastic masks flood the market every November. Something in the archetype resists every attempt to domesticate or destroy it. The church tried to chain him, and he wore the chains as decoration. The Nazis tried to co-opt him, and he outlived their regime. The psychologists tried to ban him for the good of children, and he came back stronger. The internet tried to turn him into Viking mythology, and the scholars corrected the record, and the real history proved darker and more interesting than the fabricated past. Fellow seekers of uncomfortable truths, if you stayed this far, you understand why these archives matter. The lies we tell about our traditions reveal what we fear to face. The propaganda that rewrites folklore shows us how power works and why it fails. The stories that survive suppression teach us something about what human communities need, even when authorities and experts insist we should outgrow those needs. Subscribe to walk deeper into the archives where propaganda meets folklore, where sanitized legends meet uncomfortable evidence, where the Christmas stories we inherited split open to reveal the hunger and cold and fear they were always about. Share in the comments which winter demon walked through your childhood. Krampus himself, Belsnickel in Pennsylvania's Dutch country, or perhaps something else entirely that your family or community used to teach you, that consequences existed and winter was not safe. Leave your mark if you came here believing the Viking story and you are leaving with Alpine truth. The masks are carved. The chains are forged. The birch rods are bundled and waiting. December 5th is coming. The hoofprints are already in the snow outside. See you in the next tomb.